Okay, welcome to our Tuesday night Torah study. I'm Jerry Watkins, and here we are Tuesday night. It's almost 5 o'clock. I guess it is 5 o'clock, and we're reading through the Torah. I say this periodically, but I want to say it again. We chose to read through at a pace that was comfortable for us, and us being this group here that wants to meet together and study it. So it's not quite the same yearly cycle that has been used since the time of Yeshua or before, but it's not a lot. It's stretched out a little bit. It gets through the whole Torah in like a year and a half as opposed to just a year, which is what the standard cycle does. Anyway, the reason we did that is because we voted and decided that we would rather make sure and discuss everything that we had to discuss and not leave stuff. A lot of times with the existing Torah cycle, after a little while, you're not through the portion and you have to quit and you never get that last little bit done. And so we didn't want to do that. Anyway, enough said. We're in Genesis chapter 48. I don't remember. I should have written down exactly when we started, but we've been certainly, this is the 12th portion, and we've certainly been over 12 weeks. So we're moving a little bit slower. I should pray first. Well, Father God, thank you for the day. Thank you for the beautiful weather we've been having. Thank you for the election that we're having. And I ask that you keep things peaceful. And I ask that you have your hand in the way things turn out. Bless our discussion this evening. Keep us on track. Help us to pay attention and to hear you, to listen for you to speak to us, and to just be aware of the fact that you would like us to learn more about you and more about the way you would like us to behave and conduct our lives. In Yeshua's name, amen. Okay, I always like to begin with a short little review of last week. Last week, we'd been going through this episode where Joseph is in charge of Egypt and Egypt's famine relief program because of his ability to interpret the dreams that Pharaoh had for him. You remember we made a big deal about the fact that Joseph didn't interpret them. God interpreted them, and Joseph just told him what God had done. Anyway, Pharaoh said anybody that's this smart ought to be the same guy that manages through this 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And so Joseph got declared the number two guy in Egypt. And so they made it through the 7 years of plenty without any trouble, where Joseph saved, I forgot what it was, 20% maybe, of all that they had made. Joseph stored up. And the famine has been around. I think it's been around 3 years, about the time we started this last week here. And everybody in the surrounding neighborhood there, the area of Egypt, was starving, obviously, because it was a famine. And so Jacob and his family were in that condition too. So he sent his sons, except Benjamin, who he didn't want to entrust to them, to go off to Egypt and see if they could get food. And they went off to Egypt, and they went to the guy that handled the food distribution program, and they didn't recognize him as Joseph. It had been 17 years, I think, and they didn't recognize him. And so Joseph was trying to figure out whether or not they'd changed. And so he executed this plan. The Bible story doesn't tell you that it was some plan that he kind of thought up beforehand, but his point is have they changed any? Are these the same selfish, rambunctious, narrow-minded people that sold him into slavery in the first place? And so while his brothers didn't recognize him, he recognized them, and he made them go back to, he sent them back with food and some various stuff, but he said, he kept one brother, Simeon, as hostage, so to speak, and says, when you come back, you bring this younger brother that you told me about, and then I'll decide whether or not you've been telling us the truth. He accused them of being spies. And of course, we went through the drama of Jacob not wanting to give up Benjamin to go back there because his sons didn't have a real good track record of doing things the way they should. Anyway, he finally did. We saw the point where Jacob decided, I give up. I have to do this. So you can take Benjamin with you. And Judah it was that promised and said, if I don't bring him back safely to you, I will bear the guilt for the rest of my life. And it meant something, evidently. Jacob says, okay, you can do it. And if I am bereaved, I am bereaved. In other words, if I die, if he dies, I'm going to the grave in sorrow. And if that's the case, that's the case. So they went off, and they met Joseph again, and Joseph went through this big elaborate plan where he basically took his own silver chalice and stuck it in Benjamin's sack, sent the brothers on their way, and then sent somebody after them shortly and said, accused them of stealing. And they opened up the sacks, and there in Benjamin's sack was this silver chalice that had been planted, and they brought them all back. And it was this part. It's a really interesting part. Let me show where it is. It's in Genesis chapter 44, and it starts in verse 18. When they come back, Joseph accuses them of stealing this obviously valuable thing, and they don't know how it happened. It doesn't have any exchange between them and Benjamin, but obviously there's the cup in Benjamin's sack, so what were they to think? Benjamin doesn't seem like the kind of guy that would do that, obviously. So they come back and they say, what can we say? This in verse 16. What can we say to my Lord? That is Joseph. Judah replied, what can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my Lord's slaves, we ourselves, and the one who was found to have the cup. But Joseph said, far be it from me to do such a thing. Only the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you go back to your father in peace. And this just stabbed Judah right through the heart, because Judah had already been one time in front of his father saying, we found this bloody robe here. Do you know whom this belongs to? Right? And it was obviously Joseph's, and they knew very well who it belonged to. And it had such an effect on their father that Judah, well, all of them have been sitting around harboring this guilt for 17 years now. They were, I guess it's more than that, it's about 20. They were racked with guilt. And so Judah gives this little speech. I mean, the thought of him going to his father and doing this yet again with the only other brother that Joseph had is just more than he can bear. And verse 18 to the end of that chapter is a real, it's something that you can read anytime you ever begin to think that the Bible is some old piece of literature that doesn't make any sense anymore, or that it doesn't have any relevance to today, because it's so moving you can hardly read the thing without really feeling for Joseph and the situation that he's in. And so finally then in chapter 45, Joseph says, I can't take it anymore, and he reveals himself. And of course the brothers are the phrase we'd use in New Zealand, they're gobsmacked. They can't believe what they're seeing, and they're sitting there, and of course the first thing they think is, oh my gosh, what's he going to do? We've caused all this trouble. He's going to kill us for sure. And it goes on, and we read that, and that's kind of where we are. And then Joseph says, you're forgiven. I see that God worked in my life to bring about the saving of many people, and not the least of whom are you and my father's family. So why should I be angry with that? And then is the words he says, I guess we might get to him tonight. He says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. So he says, I'm not vindictive or vengeful about it. And they can't believe it. They still can't believe it. We'll find at the very end of the chapter, they still don't believe it. But he puts things back together, and then he loads them all up with food and grain, and Pharaoh hears about this and says this is really great news, and donates a bunch of carts and stuff and sends them all back to Jacob, and tell Jacob that Joseph has been found. People a lot of times around in this movement wear a T-shirt that says in Hebrew, Yosef Kai, Joseph lives. And that's what that's about. That's what they did. They went back to their father and they said, Joseph lives. And of course, we read the part there where Jacob, it says, the spirit of Jacob was revived. Let's see, where is that? This is chapter 45. At the end of chapter 45, and this is a good place to then start. So they went out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. And they told him, Joseph is still alive. In fact, he's the ruler of all Egypt. Jacob was stunned, and he did not believe them. Who would? But when they told him everything that Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts that Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. So Jacob came out of this 20-year depression, if you will, and said, wow, this is too good to be true. Must have been much like the feeling Joseph had when Pharaoh had him yanked out of prison and cleaned up and put before Pharaoh to interpret his dream. Anyway, verse 28 says, and Israel said, Jacob said, I'm convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. So that's where we quit last week. So this week, we'll start at verse 46. Does anybody have any comments they want to make about that before we go on? I always have to look out over the sea of hundreds and see if there are any hands. But okay, fine. We'll go on. Chapter 46. So Israel set out with all that was his, and when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. I want to stop here for just a minute. This is our little map here, so I can draw stuff. Jacob and the brothers were living in Hebron up here. So to get down to Egypt, he would basically head down like this, okay? And so it says that he stopped in Beersheba, which is right there, and he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And so then from there, they would just go over like that. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Here I am, he replied. Verse 3 says, I am God, the God of your father. He said, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. Then Jacob left Beersheba with his sons, Israel's sons. Israel's sons took their father Jacob and their children and their wives and the carts that Pharaoh had sent to transport them. They also took with them their livestock and the possessions they had acquired in Canaan, and Jacob and all his offspring went to Egypt. He took with him to Egypt his sons, grandsons, and his daughters and granddaughters, all of his offspring. So the question I'd like to pose first off here is, do you think it's significant, or what do you think might be some of the significance of the fact that Jacob stopped in Beersheba and offered sacrifice to the God of his father Isaac? And what do you think of God's response, starting in verse 3?
I've got a question on that.
Okay.
Are we to read anything into that where it says he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac and not his God?
There might be something there, but since, I don't know, you can think about it, maybe come up with something. My point was simply that it's real clear who we're talking about. Now, why he talks about it that way, I really don't have a good feeling for.
It seems a little odd.
Yeah, it does seem a little odd.
Because he could have said, if he didn't want to say it was his God, he could have said it was the God of Abraham.
Yep.
So I probably doesn't mean anything, but it's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yep, the God of your father. I'm the God of your father. Yep. Anyway, he says in verse 3.
Jerry, that's interesting too.
Oh, yeah. He says, I'm the God of your
Or
father.
your
He
father.
didn't say, I know.
That's interesting.
That is interesting. I don't know what to make of that. Just the one I wanted to key in with was, don't be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. Now, why is that significant? Do you remember what Abraham's servant Eleazar asked Abraham when Abraham sent him to Haran to get a wife for his son Isaac? Abraham got his servant Eleazar and says, I want you to go to Haran to my brother's house and find a wife for my son Isaac. And do you remember any of that exchange? What one of the questions was? It was, what if she refuses to come with me? Should I let Isaac go to her? And you remember what Abraham's response was? No. He said, no, you do not. He says, if she refuses to come, then this obligation is null and void and you don't have to do it. But she has to come. He basically said, we can go look it up, but he basically said, under no circumstances are you to let Isaac to go there. Now, part of that was, and the thing that I really wanted to kind of key into there is that God promised Abraham the land. And he says, you go down to this land that I will show you, and I'm going to give it to you. And he wanted him to stay there, right? And so Abraham stayed there, and Isaac stayed there, and Jacob stayed there. Jacob, the one thing you can say about him, in spite of all of his tomfoolery, was that he really wanted God's blessing. He wanted to do what God wanted him to do. And so the idea, I'm telling you what I think, it may not be true, the idea that going to Egypt with all of his family would be what God wanted was kind of surprising. I mean, I'm sure he had some niggling thoughts in the back of his mind along the lines of, well, geez, I've spent my whole life here occupying the land that God said he was going to give to me and my offspring, just as my father did and just as my grandfather did. Can this be right? And so what's God say? He says, do not be afraid to go to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. So another thing about the gods in these times, the way the people of this society dealt with gods, is the gods tended to be location specific. You'd go to some city, state, some place, and they had a god that was there. And a lot of times when you left, you left that god too. So this whole idea, he says, I will go down to Egypt with you, is a little bit unusual for the time. Go ahead.
What's the history of the events that happened at Beersheba? I mean, didn't Abraham make a covenant?
Yep. Oh yeah, Abraham made a covenant there. Isaac made a covenant there. Beersheba, the two biggies in the book of Genesis are Beersheba and Hebron. And there were several things there.
Hadn't God revealed that they were going to be in, his descendants were going to be in Egypt for 400 years?
Yes.
As slaves?
Yes. He told Abraham that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that if he passed that down to his sons,
mm-hmm.
and did that have it, that really
that's a good point.
would have shook him up.
Yep. Well, and when you think about it, he almost had to have passed that down.
Right.
Because the guy that wrote this was Moses, right?
Right.
And the only way Moses could have written all of this was to have heard it, and the only way he could have heard it was for Abraham to have heard it, and Abraham told Isaac, and Isaac told Jacob, and etc. So, yeah. But then the question that would run through Jacob's mind would be, could this be that time?
Right.
Is this that event?
Right. And do I want any part of it?
Yeah. Yep.
Well, my options are starving or going to Egypt. Well, I'll go to Egypt.
Yep. So anyway, he basically, I think it was very kind of God and helpful for us when we're considering all that he basically encouraged Jacob, said, yes, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go to Egypt, and I don't want you to worry about it. Don't be afraid, because I'm going to be with you. So it says Jacob left Beersheba, and Israel's sons took their father, Jacob, and their children. Oh, by the way, it says Joseph's own hand will close your eyes there in verse 4. Of course, we know the close your eyes is a euphemism for he'll see you into death, if you will. So that would indicate that Jacob probably had at least a pretty strong idea that he was going to die in Egypt, which we'll find out later on tonight that he took that very seriously too. Anyway, so gathers all his junk, everything he owns, all his family, everybody, and off they go, right? So we'll start in verse 8 here. These are the names of the sons of Israel, Jacob and his descendants, who went into Egypt. Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob. The sons of Reuben were Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. The sons of Simeon, Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jakin, Zohar, Joel, the son of a Canaanite woman. The sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The sons of Judah, Onan, Shelah, Perez, and Zerah. But and Onan had died in the land of Canaan. So and Onan, do you remember who those guys are? What name would you tie to those two guys? This is a test.
They're the sons that died.
Yep. Tamar was the name you'd tie to those guys, right? Because Tamar was the wife of and when he died, she became the wife of Onan, and when he died, she was destined to become the wife of Shelah, but
Why
Judah was afraid.
Why was Onan picked to be the husband out of all those other brothers? There's brothers that are older than he is.
No. The way the sons worked is the eldest was the second one was Onan, and the third one was Shelah. And as a matter of fact, the mother of Perez and Zerah was Tamar. So that was a definite, how can I put it? Well, it's illegitimate, if you will, because Judah was not supposed to be having babies with his son's wife, right? Which is what that was. So I think that's interesting. I don't know why the Bible puts that stuff in here, but it's just very interesting. I guess one of the things it's supposed to show us is that God forgives, which is probably worth knowing. Anyway, finishing verse 12, it says, the sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamul. The sons of Issachar were Tola, Puah, Jashub, and Shimron. Oh, we're in chapter 46, Luz. Okay. Verse 14, the sons of Zebulun were Sered, Elon, and Jalil. These were the sons that Leah bore to Jacob in Padan Aram. Okay. Besides his daughter Dinah, these sons and daughters of his were 33 in all. The sons of Gad, Zephon, Haggai, Shunai, Esbon, Eri, Arodi, and Areli. And the sons of Asher, Imnah, Ishva, Ishvi, and Beriah. Their sister was Sarah. The sons of Beriah were Heber and Malchiel. These were the children born to Jacob by Zilpah, whom Laban had given to his daughter Leah, 16 in all. Then the sons of Jacob's wife, I'm in verse 19, then the sons of Jacob's wife Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. In Egypt, Manasseh and Ephraim were born to Joseph by Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On. The sons of Benjamin were Bela, Becher, Ashbel, Gera, Naaman, Ahi, Rosh, Mupim, and Ard. That's like winking, blinking, and nod. Anyway, verse 22, these were the sons of Rachel who were born to Jacob, 14 in all. And the son of Dan was Hushim, and the sons of Naphtali were Jaziel, Bunai, Jazer, and Shalim. These were the sons born to Jacob by Bilhah, whom Laban had given to his daughter Rachel, 7 in all. All those who went to Egypt with Jacob, those who were his direct descendants, not counting his sons' wives, numbered 66 persons. With the 2 sons who had been born to Joseph in Egypt, the member of Jacob's family which went to Egypt were 70 in all. Okay. So there's been some discussion about the numbers there. if you go through and you look at it real carefully, sometimes they don't appear to add up. There are any of a host of different explanations for that, and none of them I have found to be very insightful. I mean, you can count them up and you can kind of come up with your own number, but it really doesn't matter. The reason the number is 70 is because 70 is a number of nations. The 70 nations were, 70 is the number of nations that were divided up after the Tower of Babel, for example. So it's more the number 70 from a symbolic meaning than it is the math adds up. But the math does add up, depending on whether or not you make the assumption that, for example, Dinah was added in, because Dinah was a daughter. And more than likely, there were many more daughters than her. Dinah just happens to be the daughter that was mentioned in Scripture. So I guess my point is I wouldn't make a big deal about whether that number adds up to 70. The reason I say all that is there's been a fair amount of discussion about that. A lot of people take that and then some reason for that and then go way out on a limb and come up with some big thing. So I'm heading that off at the pass, so to speak. So any thoughts about that? Let me go on then. In verse 28, now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get directions to Goshen. When they arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. So let me go back to the map here. So they left from Beersheba and they're making this big wagon train over here. Now Goshen is this area right here. It's as you can see, it's south of the Mediterranean Sea. It's kind of in the upper part of the Nile Delta. This is the Nile Delta, all this area down here. And Goshen, from what I've been told, is a little hilly. What the attractiveness about the Nile Delta was that it was all relatively flat. And the Egyptians were the ones that really learned how to irrigate. And so the Nile was a real reliable flood thing. Every year it flooded, and they kind of knew when it was going to flood, and they could capture the flood water and route it around and water their crops and everything. So most of the agricultural growth in Egypt occurred in this floodplain in the delta. Goshen, again, then was up a little hill. And the reason being up in the hills is important is because it wasn't suitable for flood irrigation, but it was great to raise livestock, especially things like sheep and goats that'll eat, when Mark Twain went to Israel, he said that he thought the goats over there ate rocks because it looked like that's all there was to eat anyway. But so the sheep and the goats could be comfortable, and it's the kind of land that Jacob and his sons would have been comfortable with coming from Beersheba. So that's the reason it's important. But it comes out here a little bit more in a minute. So if you got you got a thought or you just...
Well, I wanted to go back to the Delta.
Okay.
Normally, if you think of the Mississippi, which is not as big,
Mm-hmm.
but that Delta gets replenished with soil every time it floods.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the best. I mean, granted, they could probably control the water to some extent,
Mm-hmm.
but the real benefit of that has got to be that soil.
I'm sure you're right. I'm sure you're right. Yeah, it's and I don't think that the let's see. I know that the Egyptians were pretty good at irrigating, but I'm sure that they worked in concert with the routine flooding, with the predictable flooding, and they used all of that to their advantage. But the Egyptians were known to be the agricultural producers, whereas most of the people up in the other part the rains were irregular, and it was hard to know when you'd get a good crop and when you wouldn't, so most of them were herders. So that's the main thing.
How many miles do you suppose it was from up there to Goshen?
From here to there, I would say 100, maybe less. It's not far. It's not very far. I've been through most of that area. I know you can drive from Etzion Geber up here to Gaza in about 2 hours.
Yeah, but back then, taking all those people and all their cattle and everything they took.
I'm sure it
My
took a
golly.
week. Yeah, but it wasn't like, I would say a week or a few days. I wouldn't say a month. I don't know. I'm just guessing, but that's kind of what I'd say. Okay, so anyway, so this verse 29 there in chapter 46 is Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." And then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and speak to Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household, who were living in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds. They tend livestock, and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. And when Pharaoh calls you in and asks, 'What is your occupation?' you should answer, 'Your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did.' Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians." Okay? So I wanted to discuss that for a couple of minutes. First of all, this idea of shepherds being detestable to the Egyptians, we saw that a little bit earlier when Joseph was having all his brothers, hosted them all for lunch that day or for dinner, and he had them all sit at a table, and he had to sit at a table by himself because Egyptians didn't eat with foreigners or with herders. And we talked some about the kind of the snobbish nature of the Egyptians, and especially the ruling class. So, and we know that the Egyptians did tend to be farmers, not cattle or sheep herders. So anyway, but Joseph makes a big deal about this is what you need to tell Pharaoh, and he has a plan for that. And what the plan is, he tells him what the objective is. Says, what is your occupation? When it calls you in and asks you, this is verse 33. You should answer, your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen. Okay? Goshen, like I say, right here, which is a good place to raise your sheep and whatnot. But there are other reasons why Goshen might be considered a good place for Jacob's family to settle. And I wonder, based on things that we've just talked about in the past few minutes, what you might think of that would be a good reason why settling Jacob's family in Goshen would be a good thing to do. Yeah.
Is Egyptians are racist? They
Well,
want to separate them.
Yep. Racism is I don't know if I like the term.
I know.
But yeah, it's the Egyptians would be happier if the Canaanites, the Hebrews, settled somewhat separate from them. I mean, they certainly didn't mind the fact that they were good at raising sheep and all that, because they had a need for sheep, and that was good. But they didn't want them to live in their neighborhood. But that has a benefit to the Hebrews as well. They would be less likely to assimilate, right? They would be less likely to learn about the Hebrew God or the Egyptian gods and to learn some of the practices of the Egyptians. So I really think that's an important point, because one of the things that needed to happen for God's plan, as we're witnessing as it unfolds even today, is that Jacob's family had to remain separate. And it's what he calls us to do. He calls us to, you need to live with the people, but you shouldn't be of the people. You should be in them, but not of them. And so I think God did Joseph was doing exactly what God wanted him to do by providing for them living in Goshen, which would allow them to be separate and stay separate, maintain some kind of a separateness, yet be able to live good lives, So I think that's a point worth making.
Well, weren't they kind of considered less because they were shepherds instead of whatever everybody else did?
Yep.
I thought they was considered less.
Yep, it says they're detestable. All shepherds are detestable. We're looked down upon, without a doubt. But like I say, if nothing else I get out of this, the Egyptians were pretty snobby. And they could be in this point because they're the only ones with food, right? So they could be snobby if they wanted to. And who's going to challenge them, right? So let's move on to chapter 47. This gets kind of interesting. So Joseph went and told Pharaoh, "My father and brothers, with their flocks and herds and everything they own, have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen." He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked the brothers, "What are your occupation?" And "Your servants are shepherds," they replied to Pharaoh, "just as our fathers were." They also said to him, "We have come to live here a while because the famine is severe in Canaan and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now, please, let your servants settle in Goshen." Okay, couple thoughts about this. Joseph takes some of his brothers to Pharaoh and introduces them. Now, why do you suppose he took 5? Not specifically the number 5, but why do you suppose he didn't take them all?
He probably trusted him to do what he told him to do.
Well, that could be. That could be. Maybe the 5 of them were the 5 most reasonable and wouldn't be all weird. That could be. That could be for sure. I don't know this for sure, but I read it and I thought it was kind of interesting. The Egyptians, well, like anybody in this situation, a little bit distrustful. So they see this group of people come in and say, "We'd like to stay here for a while." They're kind of thinking, "Oh man, this could be bad, right? This could be trouble." And so it could be, the story goes, it could be that taking 5 of his brothers, 5 of the most presentable ones, to Pharaoh would perhaps, settle his fears and make him not as likely to let his imagination run with. You remember that's what the Pharaoh that came after this one did. Says the Hebrews are getting way too numerous for us. They're gonna rise up and overthrow us, and they were paranoid about that. And so it could be that Joseph was sensitive to that already. Yeah. He says a little while, but I do think it was important. He said to him, "We have come to live here a while." I think who knows what that really word is in Hebrew, but I believe it's been translated properly here. In other words, they didn't say, "We have come to locate here, indefinitely." They indicated that it was for the famine, for a while. Exactly. And I think that's important because that would also tend to, it doesn't say here, but it could have been that Joseph coached him in that as well. When you tell them what you're doing, make sure and emphasize that we're not staying here forever. Could be.
God also told Israel that not to be afraid to go to Egypt, and he was going to returning
That's right.
only 400 years later.
Yeah, that's right. So, verse 5, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock." So Pharaoh's all into this. Pharaoh likes Joseph. Joseph has been a good administrator for him for the past 10 or more years. And Pharaoh recognizes that. And he trusts Joseph. So he says, "I think that's great that your father and your brothers are here. Give them what they want, let them settle. Goshen's a perfect place for them," is kind of what he's saying, And if there's any of them that are particularly good at raising livestock, let them raise mine. You guys think?
Oh, I was just going to say, Joseph probably made him a lot of money too.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's why it's like, I got livestock too.
Yeah,
You guys want to play with those?
Yep.
This goes on. Pharaoh ends up owning the whole country.
That's right. We'll get there in a minute, but yeah, that's exactly right. Verse 7. Then Joseph, this is one of my favorite parts of the book of Genesis. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. So I can paraphrase that. And here's the way I would paraphrase it. Joseph brings in Jacob, beat Pharaoh. Jacob looks at this crusty old guy, Hoot, and says, good gosh, how old are you? And he says, I'm 130 years old, and they've all been hard. That's my paraphrase for what this says. Because, I mean, it's interesting that the first thing Pharaoh says to him is, how old are you? I mean, it must have been a notable thing to Pharaoh to look at this guy and say, man, you look older than dirt, dude. And then Jacob's answer, I've had a great life. No, he says, man, it's 130 years, and they've been few and difficult, and I haven't lived as long as my dad and grandfather did. Then it says, no, he wasn't kidding. He wasn't kidding. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So I just think that's an interesting passage, because I'm just sure that's true, because Pharaoh was probably middle-aged man at best at that time, and he'd been pampered his whole life. I'm sure he had the bald head and the tattooed eyebrows and all the hoo-ha and walk like an Egyptian, all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure that Jacob he was going to be rustic looking. I'm sure he had leathery skin, and he was bound to be a pretty, yeah. So I just think that's a funny passage. Then verse 11, so Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramesses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph and provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. Now, Ramesses is here, so it's just a little bit south of Goshen, and they lived in Goshen, but he settled them near Ramesses, it says. So, pretty good, huh? Okay, now we'll get on to what Marvin was talking about. Verse 13, chapter 47:13. There was no food, however, in the whole region because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. When the money of the people of Egypt and Canaan was gone, all Egypt came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? Our money is used up. Then bring your livestock, said Joseph. I will sell you food in exchange for your livestock, since your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for their horses and their sheep and goats and their cattle and donkeys. And he brought them through that year with food in exchange for their livestock. Verse 18, when the year was over, they came to him the following year and said, we cannot hide from our Lord, that is Joseph, the fact that since our money is gone and our livestock belongs to you, there's nothing left for our Lord except our bodies and our land. Why should we perish before your eyes? We and our land as well. Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh. Give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. However, he did not buy the land of the priests because they received a regular allotment from Pharaoh and had enough food from the allotment that Pharaoh gave them. That is why they did not sell their land. So Joseph said to the people, now that I have bought you and your land today for Pharaoh, here is seed for you so you can plant the ground. But when the crop comes in, give 1/5 of it to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 you may keep for seed for the fields and as food for yourselves and your households and your children. You have saved our lives, they said. May we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. We will be in bondage to Pharaoh. So Joseph established it as a law concerning land in Egypt, still in force today, that a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. It was only the land of the priests that did not become Pharaoh's. Now the Israelites settled in Egypt, in the region of Goshen, and they acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. So we'll stop there and talk about that for a minute. This is how Pharaoh ended up owning all of Egypt. Yep.
Before the famine, who is Pharaoh? I mean, what is he? Because if you watch our movies that we see about about Ben-Hur and all those, Pharaoh owns everything.
Mm-hmm.
And according to this, I mean, what was his?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what did he own? I mean, what kind of sway did he have over these people?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. There's a movie out that's called Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. And it's a pretty good movie. It's a documentary kind of a thing. But one of the things it talks about is the fact that there are in academia, there are these things they call Egyptologists that theoretically have this history of Egypt and all about it, and they've dismissed this story in particular as fable because it doesn't fit in with their timeline. But the point of this movie is that if you just make a couple of assumptions that are probably reasonable assumptions, it does fit with the timeline. And so I'd recommend the movie. You can usually find it on Netflix and different things. But let's see, where's I going with it? The reason I said that is because it talks a little about the culture of the time and kind of what was going on. I think Pharaoh has always been the title for the ruler of Egypt. I think those rulers, based on when, were sometimes in more control than at other times. So I gather, just from this passage alone, that before this, Pharaoh may have been the ruler of Egypt, but he may not have been in total control. He may not have been an absolute monarch, if you will. But after this, he was. And in a way, there's lessons here for all of us, right? Because this is the way autocratic governments work, right? They take advantage of natural events to increase their own wealth at the expense of common people. And these people were fine with it in that they said, well, man, you're great. You saved our lives. Sold everything they owned, including themselves, right? And did you see what the income tax rate was? 20%, right? So 20% of everything you grow during this famine is mine, is Pharaoh's. But you can use the other 80% to feed your family and to plant for next year and all that kind of stuff. So like it says, thus Pharaoh becomes the owner of all Egypt. And again, that happens until there's some kind of an uprising or a revolution or something like that. But at the end of this time, Pharaoh was the absolute dictator of Egypt. I didn't say that. But there are lessons to be learned, is the point. And it's worth thinking about. That's all I'm trying to say.
We'll have to revisit that in the morning.
All right. Moving right along. It does say, verse 27, the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. Now, why might the Israelites do better there than the Egyptians were doing? Go ahead.
Because they were herdsmen. They know how to use the land. It's just natural to them.
Yeah.
Well, and obviously they had less competition because all the Egyptians wanted to be down in the Delta because they know how to grow.
Yep, those are good. And of course, not stated, but obviously you'd agree with this. And God blessed them. Yeah, but yeah, there's several reasons why it wouldn't be, how can I put it, a contradiction for the Israelites to do okay or better and the Egyptians not. Yeah.
Well, they weren't buying food.
Yeah, they were raising their own.
Well, either that or didn't Joseph give them food?
Well, that's probably true too.
Yeah,
that's
so
probably true too. It says
that
he
was
did.
a big
Yeah,
part of it.
yeah, that's part of it too. They lived off Joseph. Joseph was a cool character, really. Yep.
Joseph come up with all those cruel taxation to the people? Like,
Well, first of all, I will point out that the word is, the word cruel is never used. Joseph, I think, did all this. Now, whether he did it because the Pharaoh told him to do it, or whether he did it because it seemed good to him, I don't know. I don't know. In some sense, let's see. I don't know. Don't know what to tell you. Because I don't know that Joseph knew where this was headed. You know what I mean? I don't even know whether it was a bad thing. I mean, what we know next, when we go read the book of Exodus, is that a Pharaoh rose, Joseph and all his brothers died, and a Pharaoh rose that didn't know about Joseph, and he started oppressing the Hebrews. But that was a different time. That was a generation or two later. So I don't know.
seems like you own nothing, and Pharaoh own you.
Yeah. Well,
including-
the Egyptians ended up with their livelihood. I mean, they ended up with actually. The term for what they're doing there is called sharecropping. And it was common clear up in the United States in the before the Civil War. Sharecropping occurred, and the land owner would say to some farmer, "I'll give you the land, and you can raise crops on it. And if you give me a percentage of everything you raise, then you can stay there as long as you want." That was a common thing in Europe too. Is my understanding that percentage was usually more along the lines of 10% than 20%, but I don't know. I really don't. And not only that, but who knows? Go ahead.
I would think also the Egyptians would be a little jealous when they seen the Jews were blessed by the Lord and how their crops grow and everything else. I would think there'd be a little bit of jealousy there.
Well, there's bound to be that. There is that whenever we get to the book of Exodus. Yeah, for sure.
Whenever the good times, the 7 years, and he told them to give him 20%, he set the standard there.
Yeah.
And before that, I don't know what they gave. Who knows? Maybe it was a smaller percentage, but since something was coming, he increased it and he kept it.
Yeah.
Kept the same tax rate.
Yep. It's interesting. It's just interesting how all this works. I love this part. The fact that the Bible goes into this detail is interesting to me. It says it's okay to think about stuff like this. Things, let's see, how can I put it? Things don't just always happen miraculously. This is how it occurred that he's telling you. Verse 28. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. So 130 when he met Pharaoh, 17 more makes him 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt. But when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried." "I will do as you say," he said. "Swear to me," he said. Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. I have another translation for that. Israel bowed down at the head of his bed. So they obviously had trouble with leaned on the top of his staff versus bowed down at the head of the bed. In any case, the promise is the key thing. Where have we heard this, "Put your hand under my thigh and swear to me," before? Yep, the servant, Eleazar, when Abraham sent Eleazar back to Haran to get Rebekah, or to get a wife for Isaac. That's where we heard that before. It occurs to me, I'm just now thinking of this, but whenever you see connections like that, it's worth going back and comparing the two. Look at that story and look at this story and just kind of see if there are any similarities.
That's why I was asking about like what events happened at Beersheba to see if there was some correlation
Mm-hmm.
between the vision or the dream
Mm-hmm.
have
Yeah.
versus other events that have happened.
There may be.
I would
Yeah,
assume that
there may
would
be. Yeah. That's good. I like that. Okay, where would they be buried? Where was Jacob asking to be buried?
Wasn't it Hebron or somewhere
Mhm.
in there?
Yeah, you want to get any more specific?
I can't think of the name of the field. Isn't it?
Yeah,
That he bought
yep.
for silver.
The cave of Machpelah, at the end of the field that was owned by Ephron the Hittite. So yeah, it would, what Jacob made Joseph swear to do was when he died, take him from here back to Hebron and bury him. Who else is buried there in that tomb in Machpelah? Let's see. Whose wife? No, Rachel was probably not buried there. Rachel died, if you remember, on the trip from where they lived with Laban and Leah. Leah was buried there. That's right. Leah was buried there, as well as Rebekah, his mother, and Isaac, his father, and Sarah, his grandmother, and Abraham, his grandfather. So that's where he wanted to be buried, along with them. Cool, huh? Okay, you want to go on? We're in chapter 48. This gets better. Sometime later, Joseph was told, "Your father is ill." So he took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, along with him. When Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to you," Israel rallied his strength and sat up on the bed. Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty," that would be Yahweh Sabaoth, I think, "has appeared to me at Luz, in the land of Canaan. And there he blessed me and said to me, I'm going to make you fruitful and will increase your numbers. I will make you a community of peoples, and I will give this land as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you." Now, do you happen to remember where he said, "He appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan"? You remember what event that was? You can go back and look this up, but I'll just see if you want to guess. It's when, go ahead. That's exactly when it was. It's when he left home. It's when his mom said, Esau is really irritated, really hacked off at you for having stolen the blessing the way you did, and he's threatened to kill you. Now you need to go find a wife for yourself with my uncle or with your uncle Laban, and so get yourself up there and go. So I don't want you killed. And so kind of hurriedly, I think, Jacob said, okay, fine. So he heads off. And that first night he's out on his own, sleeping with his head on a rock. And that's where you have the Jacob's ladder story and all that kind of stuff. That's the event that's being referred to. And that's exactly when God did that. That's when God basically promised. He gave the same promise that he had given to Abraham and that he had given to Isaac to Jacob. So it goes on in verse 5. He says, "Now then, your 2 sons born to you in Egypt before I came to you here will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine." See, do you see what he's done there? He's basically multiplied Joseph by 2, right? Joseph was one of Jacob's 12 sons. But then he says, your 2 sons will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. In other words, they can be your sons if you want, but they're going to be mine also. So in the place of you, there are now 2 sons. Now, what would this do to the inheritance? Yeah, that gives Joseph a double portion, right? Because there are 2 of him now, if you will. And that's exactly what Jacob wanted to do. So I think that's kind of important, yeah.
But did the remaining sons, did they get 1?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So those 2, or Joseph is responsible for the rest of the family.
Well, no,
You with
double,
me?
yes, the double portion is different than leadership. And we'll talk about that some more in a few minutes.
But that's why you get the double portion, is you got to take care of everybody.
Well, yes, theoretically.
Okay.
But we'll see some. I mean, you can't argue with what I'm saying. I mean, I don't know. I can't really explain in great detail because I don't understand it. Why all it works out it does. All I know is that Jacob wanted to do this. Jacob wanted to basically multiply Joseph by 2. which is what he did. Okay, let's go on. We'll read the rest of the story here. Okay, let's see. He says, verse 6, he goes on, he says, any children born to you after them will be yours in the territory that they inherit. They will be reckoned under the names of their brothers. In other words, this is a multiply by 2. It's not a multiply by 3, 4, 5, or however many more kids you have. You know, any other kids you have, they're part of that family. Okay. As I was returning from Padan to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan while we were still on the way, a little distance from Ephrath. So I buried her there beside the road to Ephrath. And then in parentheses it says that is Bethlehem. Okay. Now, this was a long time ago, but I remember driving down the road between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and there was at that time, I doubt if it even is still there. There was this, whitewashed adobe kind of a structure about, 10 feet by 8 feet or something that had a roof on it, and it was clearly labeled this was Rachel's tomb. Now, the truth of the matter is, at that point in time, who knows? It may or may not have been, but at least they had the location more or less correct.
Yeah, it's still there.
It's still there.
We went there in December,
Good
and
deal.
they have the big wall around Bethlehem.
Uh-huh.
And but right outside, they have a structure labeled.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Anyway, goes on in verse 8. When Israel saw the sons of Joseph, he asked, who are these? Verse 9 says, they are the sons God has given me here, Joseph said to his father. Then Israel said, bring them to me so that I may bless them. Now Israel's eyes were failing because of old age, and he could hardly see. So Joseph brought his sons close to him, and his father kissed them and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face again, and now God has allowed me to see your children too. Then Joseph removed them from Israel's knees and bowed down with his face to the ground. And Joseph took both of them, Ephraim on his right toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh on his left toward Israel's right hand, and he brought them close. But Israel reached out his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head, as though he was the younger, and crossing his arms, he put his left hand on Manasseh's head, even though Manasseh was the firstborn. I have a picture of that. Okay, that's what he did. I should point out, this is a minor aside. That picture is from the cover of a book called The Firstborn Factor in the Plan of Redemption by good friends of mine, Ephraim and Ramona Frank. And it's a good book. You can read that book, and it talks about some of the prophetic implications of what's going on here and how it's applicable today. So if you want to get that book and look at it, you can certainly do so. But I liked the picture. When I read this, every time I read this, it's pretty clear what it's saying, but it's nice if you kind of have a picture in your mind of what's going on. So that's what's happened. So going back on verse 15 says, then he blessed Joseph and said, may the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys, and may they be called by my name and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly upon the earth. When Joseph saw his father placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he was displeased, and so he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to him, no, my father, this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations. He blessed them that day and said, in your name will Israel pronounce this blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. And so he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Okay, what does all this mean? I'm not entirely sure, but we talked several weeks back about how the Ephraim is symbolic of the the lost northern kingdom of Israel and how we believe that it's going to be reconstituted someday. God's going to bring the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah together. And so this is that Ephraim. So part of what's going on here has got to do with that. So you need to know this is here. You need to think about it, and maybe someday it'll make more sense to you. It makes a little sense to me, but I've got to work on it a little harder. Let's see, there was one other point I wanted to make about that, and it slipped away from me. Darn. Maybe it'll come back. Bear with me a second. Well, anyway. Enough said. Are there any thoughts about that? Anybody have any comments? Verse 16, the angel, this is usually the angel of the Lord, that is God, right? The angel who delivered these boys from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly upon the earth. That's good. That's good. I now remember the other thing I was going to point out, and this is just an aside also, but I think it's kind of interesting. The firstborn is supposed to be the leader. He's supposed to be the inheritor, if you will, the primary inheritor, the double portion guy. But it hasn't happened hardly at all, right? It didn't happen with Abraham because technically it should have been Ishmael, not Isaac, right? It didn't happen with Isaac because technically it should have been Esau and not Jacob. And it didn't happen with Jacob because technically it should have been Reuben, and it turned out to be, take your pick, either Joseph / Ephraim Manasseh or Judah, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And it didn't happen with Joseph because it should have been Manasseh, and it turned out to be Ephraim. So God, for whatever reason, has superseded this idea of the eldest son at least 4 times, just right here in the last few chapters of Genesis. Beg your pardon? 4 generations, yeah. Interesting. So let me read the last couple verses of chapter 48. Then Israel said to Joseph, I am about to die, but God will be with you and take you back to the land of your fathers. And to you, as one who is over your brothers, I give you the ridge of land that I took from the Amorites with my sword and my bow. That's kind of cryptic. There's an alternate translation that says, and to you I give one more portion than to your brothers. The portion of land that I took from the Amorites with my sword and my bow. So there's a couple places in the coming few chapters where we're going to see text that they've obviously had trouble translating. Yes?
It's real interesting. Joseph is never going to take this land.
No. Yep. Joseph, like I say, I really think somewhere along the line after Joseph, Joseph fell into the wonderful trap of being Pharaoh's number 2 guy, it dawned on him he was Egyptian. He was instrumental in saving his family and saving the Israelites, but he was Egyptian. Bottom line, and he knew it.
I don't know if this has any meaning to it, but in mine, the little sub-thing says, or one portion of land, which sounds in Hebrew like the town and district called Shechem.
Shechem.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that one place where his brothers went in.
Yep. Good point. Okay, lots of things to think about here, but it's worth reading, and then it's worth rereading as time goes on. So let me move on here. I think we can do this. Verse 49, chapter 49. Jacob called for his sons and said, gather round so I can tell you what will happen to you in the days to come. Assemble and listen to the sons of Jacob Assemble and listen, sons of Jacob. Listen to your father Israel. And then it goes on, and we're going to read through these and talk about them to the extent that we can. Verse 3, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel, for you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it. Okay, so Reuben has been put in the penalty box, right? What was Reuben's big crime? Does anybody remember? Do you remember what Reuben's crime was? Yeah, well, it was one of the concubines. He went to bed with, I believe it was Bilhah. He slept with Bilhah, who was his father's concubine. That's what Bilhah was, Rachel's handmaiden. He obviously had no business doing that, but he did that. Jacob found out about it and basically disinherited him. You know, basically said, you will no longer excel, for you went up to your father's bed, upon to my couch, and defiled it. So you're out of here. Yeah. I think that's worth saying. What, you want to say it again?
This guy, even though he was almost 150 years, he did not suffer from senile dementia or.
No.
their
He
mind was
remembered, and
very
he
strong.
remembered it that whole time. Yeah, you're right. That's kind of fun. So we got Reuben, verse 9, or I'm sorry, 5. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter their council, and let me not join their assembly. For they have killed men in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they pleased. Cursed be their anger so fierce and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. Okay, so Levi and Simeon are on the hit list too. Okay, what was their crime? Do you remember? Shechem, yep. They were the guys who spearheaded the plan to get all of the Shechemites to be, all the Shechemite males to be circumcised, and then while they were recovering, went in and killed them all. This was their plan. And as they put it to their father, Jacob, well, what were we supposed to do? Just let them, defile our sister and do nothing about it? That's kind of what they said. So, and again, Jacob never forgot about it. And what is their punishment? Yeah, they're going to be scattered. So the tribes of Simeon and the tribes of Levi, what became of the tribe of Levi? They became the priests, and therefore they were scattered in Jacob or dispersed in Israel. They got no land. They were dispersed all through the land. And you probably don't remember what happened to Simeon, but I can tell you. Simeon's landholding, well, it's in the book of Joshua. Simeon's landholding was wholly encompassed, I think, within Judah's. And over time, they just kind of got assimilated into Judah, and they lost track, if you will. So they were scattered in Jacob. They ceased to become an entity, if you will. They were not a separate tribe after a number of years. Anyway, then we get to verse 8. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, O Judah. You return from the prey, my son, like a lion. He crouches and lies down like a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs. And the obedience of the nations is his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. Now, I got to say, at least half of that makes no sense to me at all. But it doesn't look like he was rained on, if you will, quite as bad as Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. Yeah, yeah. He says, "Whew, I made it," kind of a thing. Yeah. Judah is being given some honor, some credit. Can you think of any reason why Judah might have deserved that?
Well, he tried to save Joseph,
Yeah.
but in addition to that, he put his life on the line for his little brother.
Yep. He was the one that volunteered to stay so that Benjamin could go home, if you will. Yeah. So Judah redeemed himself, if you will. And so it says, it says the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff between his feet. Now, there's different translations for that, but I think the general implication is that he's going to remain the leader, if you will, the head of the family. And I think one of the easiest ways to realize that that's happened is because who do we call the people? What do we call the people that are living in Israel? We call them Jews, right? Jews comes from Judah. That's exactly where it comes from. So he did. Judah has remained the ruler, in some sense, of his people this whole time. Pretty cool. Then it gets real obscure, all right? Moving in verse 13. Zebulun will live by the seashore and become a haven for ships. His border will extend towards Sidon. So the only thing I can tell you there is the land holding of Zebulun is in the northwestern part of Israel and has some, it's near Lebanon, which is where Sidon is. Verse 14, Issachar is a raw-boned donkey lying down between two saddlebags. I have a footnote there that says campfires, whatever that means. When he sees how good his resting place and how pleasant is his land, he will bend his shoulder to the burden and submit to forced labor. I'm sure there's something to that, but I'm not sure what it is. So that's homework assignment. If you want to go figure out how that applies to Issachar, good on you. Verse 16, Dan will provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a serpent by the roadside, a viper along the path that bites the horse's heels so that its rider tumbles backward. Again, I know that the word Dan means to judge or he judges. So that's why it says justice for the people and he'll judge. But other than that, I can't tell you too much about that. If any of you have any knowledge of any of these, feel free. And then verse 18 is, I don't know why that's there. It says, I looked for your deliverance, O Lord. It's nice, but I don't know why. It seems to be sitting by itself. We're going to go through the rest of these because they're not, they're like verse 19. Gad will be attacked by a band of raiders, but he will attack them at their heels. Okay. Asher's food will be rich, and he will provide delicacies fit for a king. Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. So all of those are very cryptic for me, and I don't know exactly what they mean.
It doesn't have to be true, but that's what I heard. If you belong to this one of these tribes, according to your personality.
Yeah, I've heard things like that too.
Yeah,
Yep.
because like he said, Naphtali has beautiful sayings. Some people have the capacity to comfort others.
Yep.
And uplift.
Yeah, and it could be that. It
Then
could be something
Dan,
like that.
a serpent in the trader.
Yep.
As a
That could be, yeah. Verse 22 gets it's a little better because it's about a guy we know more about. We don't know anything about those other guys, really. But verse 22 says, Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring, whose branches climb over a wall. With bitterness, archers attacked him. They shot at him with hostility. But his bow remained steady, his strong arm stayed limber, because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, because of your father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of the heavens above, blessings of the deep that lies below, and blessings of the breast and the womb. Your father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains, than the bounty of the age-old hills. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. That's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there, and it to me it kind of sums up as that Joseph is going to. Well, it basically already happened. Joseph received an immense blessing from God to be the savior of Israel, of his family. But I'm sure there's more to that, and I'm sure it's got some prophetic meanings that I'm not real clear on. But I always struggle with these because I wish I could just tell you everything they mean, but I don't know. Verse 27, do you have something?
Gad, when they got their land, are they one of the tribes that chose their land on the other side of the Jordan?
Gad?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I want to say that I heard someone talking about this once, and that was like them being raided, because whenever anybody came in, they would always get
They were always,
first.
yep, that could be. That makes sense. I'm going to try to remember that next time.
And then Dan, didn't some of the judges come from Dan?
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, name one. I can name one.
Samson?
Samson. Samson was from the tribe of Dan. Mm-hmm. Beg pardon?
Daniel?
I don't know about that. Could be. I'm not sure. You may be right. Verse 27 says, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, and in the evening he divides the plunder. Don't know what that means. But let me go on, because we're too close to quit now. Verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them, giving each the blessing appropriate to him. I might stop here and at least point out that if all of the prophecies that God gives typically are easy to find looking backwards, but you can hardly ever predict what they mean going forwards. And there's a good reason for that, I've come to believe, and that is because if they were real simple to figure out, the adversary would figure it out and goof them up. So that's why they're obscure. But on the one hand, we are kind of toward the end now, and so we ought to know some of these. So I'm going to, next time I do this, I'll work a little harder learning some of them. Let me go on. Verse 29. Then he gave them these instructions. This is Jacob. I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave of the field, in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah, near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite, along with a field. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. So Jacob's just nailing it. This is where I want to go. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, and he breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Good timing. Chapter 50. Joseph threw himself upon his father and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming. And the Egyptians mourned him for 70 days. When the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, If I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him, my father made me swear an oath and said, I am about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go up and bury my father, then I will return. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury your father as he made you swear to do. So Joseph went up to bury his father. All of Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court and all the dignitaries of Egypt, besides all the members of Joseph's household and his brothers and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children and their flocks and herds were left in Goshen. Chariots and horsemen also went up with him. It was a very large company. And when they reached the threshing floor of Atad, near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly, and there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, The Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning. And that's why the place near the Jordan is called Abel Mitzrayim. So Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abraham had bought as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite, along with the field. And after burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. So there's a couple of interesting things there I think are worth talking about. First is the embalming. Who invented embalming? The Egyptians. The Egyptians had made, as a matter of fact, some of the things that they did for embalming have never been equaled since. You know, I mean, whenever they dug up, what was it, Tutankhamun's mummy, I mean, they said his hair was still around and his skin was more or less intact. So they really knew what they were doing. And it took 40 days. Matter of fact, some of the stuff I read says it took longer than that. So this was a sign that Joseph really was an Egyptian. I mean, you know, because he could have said, well, you know, we're not into that. We'll just take him up there and bury him, okay? But he wanted it done. The other thing that's interesting is how he approached Pharaoh with the idea of taking his father back to Machpelah to have him buried. He goes to the court, Pharaoh's court, and he says, please go to them and tell them, if I found favor in your eyes, this is verse 4, speak to Pharaoh for me and tell him, my father made me swear on an oath, blah, blah, blah. Now let me go up and bury my father, and I will return. And Pharaoh said, go up and bury your father as he made you swear to do. So Joseph just didn't say, hey, I'm going to go bury my father. You don't have a problem with that, do you? I mean, he was very respectful about it, and he knew that what he was asking was a kind of a big deal. And Pharaoh, because Pharaoh liked him, said, okay, that's fine. Go do as you said. And then who went with him? Lots of Egyptians, right? The whole family, but lots of Egyptians went too. And they all mourned. They all mourned Joseph's father's death. Now, it was not Joseph's father that was popular in Egypt. It was Joseph. So Joseph must have been quite an important figure in Egypt, you know, really. So I just think that's all very interesting, and it all makes good sense. However, you'll notice the other thing that he told Pharaoh, and this is at the end of verse 5 in chapter 50. Now let me go up and bury my father, then I will return. Right? He didn't say, and since I'm up there, and since I want to go back there, and since that's really where I want to live now, he didn't say that. He says, then I will return. So he considered his position in Egypt and his position with Pharaoh a lifetime appointment. Okay, is there anything else? I'm going to go on and finish. If you have a comment, you can make one. Yes. Yes.
Do we know other occasions in the Word where people made a big fuss over funerals and wept and so forth? Believers. The reason I'm asking is that so many believers now don't have a grieving type of funeral. Do you think it's disrespectful in Yah's sight?
That's a good question. God always talks about funerals in that way. He talks about mourning and a period of mourning and stuff like that. So I don't know. That's a good question.
In some countries, they have people that will weep and cry. They pay you to go to a funeral and cry.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they have professional criers even. They can hire criers. Yeah. That's right.
The girl that he raised from the dead, they were paid mourners that were outside.
That's a good point. I'd forgotten about that. Yeah. Interesting. See, that's what's fun about this stuff. It gets you into all kinds of things like that. Okay, let me finish. This is verse 15 in chapter 50. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? You got to laugh, don't you? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and wrongs that they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. In other words, he knew two things. He knew Dad didn't tell you this. That's the one thing he knew. And the other thing he knew is geez, guys, I told you, I forgive you. That's done. Why do you keep bringing this up? Someone mentioned last week, it's because they wouldn't forgive themselves. They hadn't been able to forgive themselves.
Well, not only did he tell them, but he showed them with his fruit of
Very
all
good
that
point.
he gave.
Yeah, exactly. But they were worried. So his brothers then came to him. This is verse 18. His brothers then came to him and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Good old Joseph. Then we'll finish the chapter. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. And so Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. In Egypt. This is in Genesis, so he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Do you know where his bones theoretically are now? They're in a tomb that's near Shechem. It's between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, and it's still there. And the scholars all poo-poo the idea that that's really Jacob or Joseph, but it's where he said he wanted to be buried, and it's where the Bible says he was buried. So, and Shechem is now, of course, the Palestinian city of Nablus. I wonder if it's on my map. Let me back up one. I don't think it's. Gotta do that. Well, Nablus is quite a bit north of Jerusalem here. Here's Jerusalem way up here, so it's not on this map. I wonder if it's another map. I don't know if it's worth all this. I'm going to give it one more second, then I'm going to quit. Okay, here we are. Right in here is Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, Shechem. So that little diamond or triangle right there is probably where Joseph's tomb is, and that's like I say, north of Jerusalem and north of Hebron, as you can see. Anyway, that's that. That is the end of the book of Genesis. Yay. This has been fun. The book of Genesis is foundational, without a doubt. I'm going to take a break from doing this for a while, and next week, Mark will be here, our congregational leader, and he is all prepared to start with the book of Exodus. And it's a good place to start. I've really enjoyed doing this. I tell you what, just as a personal testimony, it is true, and I can verify it. The more you go through this, the more you learn and the better it feels. And the more you know that we're on the right path. This is not some fad. This is not something you talk yourself into believing. There's too much here. There is too much that's just miraculous that it's even here. Especially when you consider things like, it was written 3,500 years ago in a language that was dead for a couple thousand years, and is translated into a language that was never even thought of, and yet we can read it and make sense out of it. There's just no way that this was, you can compare it to any so-called ancient literature. You won't find anything this old that holds up the way this does. So I just want to testimony to the Torah.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
a very good leader. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Let me pray, and then we'll call it done. Father God, thank you very much for your Torah, and thank you for these people that wanted to learn about it and wanted to learn about you. And I'd ask that you just bless us. You do bless us for seeking you. You say that if we diligently search for you, that you will be found by us. Yeah. And we are. This is how we diligently search for you. This is what you expect us to do. And so I just appreciate your Torah. I appreciate studying it. And I look forward to continuing to do so in the future. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, you guys. Thanks very much. Thanks a lot.